Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with people who give shape, texture, and voice to the stories that matter here on the North Fork and sometimes far beyond. Some of our guests are rooted here by generations, others join us from elsewhere to share their work, their perspective, or their connection to this community, but all bring something that resonates, something that adds to the ongoing conversation. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. In this episode, we sit down with Richard Panchyk, author of over 35 books on local history and an accomplished translator whose work has brought historical voices like Joseph Roth's to new audiences. Born and raised in Elmhurst, Queens, Richard shares how his family's heritage and upbringing in one of New York City's most culturally rich neighborhoods shaped his deep connection to the city's past. We explore his early passion for writing, his success with the 4Kids nonfiction series, and his experience conducting over 700 interviews, including with figures like Vonnegut and Rudy Giuliani. From uncovering forgotten stories of New York City, Long Island, and the North Fork, to making history accessible and engaging for readers of all ages, Panchyk offers insights into the craft of historical storytelling and the enduring impact of local history on global audiences. So I hope you enjoy episode 129 with Richard Panchyk. This episode was recorded April 8th, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. It's really nice to have you on today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So you were born and raised in Elmhurst, Queens, but can you share a bit about your family's ancestry and how that may have influenced your sense of identity and connection to New York City?
Yes, my family has been in New York City continuously since 1866, directly. My great-great-grandfather, Carl Friedrich Voigt, came to Upper Manhattan, Upper East Side, what is called Yorkville, in 1866, and he started a horseradish business. And so he raised his family in the city, and that's on my father's side. On my mother's side, she came here in 1956, and so my family has been in Elmhurst since 1956.
Wow.
So a long history in Queens and a long history in New York City in general. And I was always interested in that and just trying to find out more about their lives and what life was like back in the 19th century and what kinds of activities they may have done and what their occupations were, and trying to find pictures. And it's always been something I've been interested in, and that kind of encouraged me to do more research about New York City itself. So that kind of fostered my love for history.
Was your family already, was your parents or grandparents interested in history at that time, or just documenting and recording?
It was really more up to me to round up the history and preserve it from different corners of the family, second cousins and great aunts and people who were tangential almost to the family, but they had pictures and they had information to share, which kind of gave me the whole picture to put together.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to piece it together based on the interviews with more distant members, second cousins, and people who grew up with my direct ancestors. And in that way, I filled in the blanks, and I found new people that I had never known existed. And that was actually very helpful because they filled in the picture that I didn't have.
Yes. And also, um, you've done as a writer, you've done translations, and a distant relative of yours is Austrian writer Joseph Roth. Could you tell us more about that discovery in your connection of history and then getting to work on translating some of his work?
Yeah, as part of my family tree research, um, I found some other relatives who had done a lot of work on the family tree and branched it out all the way. And I discovered that I was distantly related to Joseph Roth. And I didn't really know that much about him at the time, but I did some research and found his books. And um, some of those books had been out of print in English since the 1930s. So I thought it would be a great idea to try to get them back in print. Um, and, we had, it was a shared identity, even though he was a distant relative, he was from the same part of Austria-Hungary that my family was from. So they kind of, it was an interesting comparison because that branch of the family had all experienced the same kinds of things and went through the Austria-Hungary and went through that transition period and the emperors and the different identities that they had to have in that part of the world at the time. Um, so I found that very interesting. And his works are all infused with that kind of dichotomy, that kind of multiple cultural, historical perspective of being in that part of the world where you're right near Russia, but you're also near, Central Europe, but you were kind of neither. So it was a very interesting time period when he was writing circa the 1920s and 30s. Um, it was also the beginning of Hitler, and Joseph Roth has the distinction of being the first writer to mention Hitler by name in a work of fiction.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
he was kind of prescient, and one of the books that I translated was called The Antichrist, and it was written about 1933-34, and it was very interesting looking at it now because it talks about some of these modern day dilemmas and issues about um, you know uh, modern life, politics, warfare, things like that. So it was very interesting to translate the work and to really understand that he was representing a period of time that I was very interested in a place I was very interested in.
Mm. Yes. And then also to just get back to where you grew up in Elmhurst, um, how was it like growing up there? Because that was a culturally rich and diverse area, and yeah, what was that like?
Well, Elmhurst is and was one of the most diverse communities in the entire country, even more so now, but even then it was. And so there was definitely my class, as a kid, had a wide representation of people. I had a girl who was from Greece. I had someone from Brazil. I had someone from Egypt. So I had a lot of different um, mix of ethnic people who were there from different countries who were like, their parents had come from that country to the US. And so that was very interesting. But the thing that I noted was because there was such a large contingent of immigrants and multiple cultures, there wasn't a strong sense of history in Elmhurst. It didn't seem like the kind of historical interest that you might have in a place that was founded in the 1600s, because there was so much turnover and there was so much change. And that was one of the things that moved me to writing about Elmhurst while I was in grad school, because there was so much history there that wasn't really known or widely understood. In fact, I discovered that the very place where I grew up, the house I lived in, was on the property of the Bretonniere farm, which
Hmm.
was the site of where General Sir William Howe had his headquarters during the winter of 1776 during the Revolutionary War. Um, the house I lived in, the house I grew up in, was on that farm property where General Howe had his headquarters. So, and it was also part of the encampment of the Hessian soldiers during that winter. The entire area behind the farmhouse was used as an encampment for the soldiers during the winter of 1776, 77. So this is stuff that I found out through research. It wasn't common knowledge. It wasn't taught in school. The school, which was right on top of the right on top of the hill where the encampment was. So it wasn't common knowledge, and I was excited to discover this and write about it in my book, Hidden History of Queens.
Hmm. No, that's really fascinating. Just to even find out all that information directly, even the house you grew up in. And then also, you went to Stuyvesant High School. Uh,
Yeah.
how did, I guess, even if you wanted to tell us how that came about, even from going from Elmhurst to Stuyvesant High School, and how was that experience, that high school experience and education in New York City?
My local high school, I was zoned for. That's where most of the people wound up going, but I wanted to
Oh,
try
okay.
to get into Stuyvesant. I wanted to take the test. Um, I took the test the first year and I didn't make it in. I made it into, I think, Brooklyn Tech and Bronx Science, but not Stuyvesant. Then the second year I got in, so I went from 10th grade to 12th grade to Stuyvesant. And it really did have an effect because I took a class called History of New York City. That was taught by a teacher named Philip Scandura, and this was one of his. It was an elective class, and he loved this class, and he had notes that were typed up, starting with 1600s and going all the way up to 1900s, and he had these notes that he'd hand out, and I still have them today. They talked all about everything from the Dutch settlement to the English and the building of the city, and it was really just very interesting for me, and that kind of pushed me to doing more research and writing about New York City. That class really set me on that path. So between the class and the genealogy, I was really heading down that road. Um, those two things pushed me in that direction.
Hmm. And coming out of high school, you kind of knew you wanted to continue writing and writing about the history of New York or New York City.
Coming out of high school, I wanted to try to do something with it. Uh, so in college, I wrote a honors college thesis about my one branch of my family in New York City in the 1800s and where they lived and what their addresses were and what how they moved around a lot. And I told the kind of a story of their lives. So yeah, I was really interested in continuing to research and write about that topic.
Hmm. And was that your first book that you published at age 21? And then soon after you started writing children's nonfiction, or was that later?
The first book was actually kind of an interesting one. Just it was about computer aided drafting, and I co-authored it with my mom. Um, it was kind of a hot topic at the time, and we both worked for an engineering firm, and so that was kind of a one-off type of book. It wasn't what I wanted to write about, but it was something. At least I got published, and after that, then I started getting into the writing of the nonfiction books. And as a young wannabe author, it was of course not easy to break in to the market, and that was even that at that time it was before the advent of Arcadia and these local history publishers that we have now. So it was even more difficult. So what wound up happening was I worked with a well-known engineer named Matt Levy, who was actually the structural designer of the Javits Center in the city and the old Georgia Dome that was since demolished in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And we wrote a book together called Engineering the City that was about basically how is a city built and what are the infrastructure what's the infrastructure that's required to build the city. And so that was my first foray, and that publisher wound up putting out many of my nonfiction books for kids.
So that's how you kind of got in, that's how you got into writing the books for children. Or even if you could talk about because you did a series for kids series, which was very popular, and just presenting history in that way for children, what did resonate so well, you think, with these younger readers at that time?
I think the series was designed to talk up, not talk down. It was designed to be challenging and make them think. Once in a while, I'd get a comment or a review that said, "This is too hard. It's not for 8-year-olds. It's not for 9-year-olds." And I was, tempted to say, well, is that you talking or is that your 9-year-old talking? Because I think most kids like to be challenged and like to, read above their level. And the
Hmm.
key to these books was to make it interesting, make it fun, and because history doesn't have to be dry, and that's why I like to include a lot of interviews, sidebars, little, you know, tangents and things like that to get their attention and to kind of show them that there's more to history than just the bare facts. It's about being able to look at it from multiple perspectives and really get all the angles on history.
Mm, definitely. I think that's important to continue to get the younger generation interested in reading about history in a fun way. And now, so you've written extensively about New York City and Long Island. You told us a bit about what initially drew you well, specifically New York City, but are there any other like particular aspects of the history that you find very fascinating to explore? Because you've kind of branched out through all of Long Island too.
Yeah, I think there's just so much history in the area that it really is worth a deeper look at. You could pick any era and you could find something interesting to talk about. So I've talked about many topics, including Roosevelt Field and the cradle of aviation is one of my favorites. I wrote a whole book on Eisenhower Park just because it's interesting out in Nassau County. I wrote a book on Greenport, because I've been going to Greenport every year for over 20 years now, just, for a quick vacation. Um,
Mm,
but there's always something interesting in that the island itself is like almost its own world. You have such different communities on the North Shore and on the South Shore and the center, and then Nassau and Suffolk, um, out in the North Fork and the South Fork. You have so much varied history, and it's almost like a world unto itself because, if you talk about Glen Cove versus Oceanside or Amagansett versus Mattituck, you have such differences and there's so much history there that it's really interesting to take a deeper look at it and share some interesting facts and stories with the rest of the world, because it is important to understand what things used to be like and what it used to look like and how life was before.
Yes. And I was just curious, you said you started coming out to Greenport maybe around like 20 years ago.
Yeah,
Um,
like 2002 or so, yeah.
I was curious just what maybe your initial thoughts were of the area or your first impressions of the area when you came out.
Yeah, it's interesting because the initial impressions were, that it was a very quaint, historic place that was preserving this history. It was kind of like a well-kept secret, almost not a full secret, but it was, less of a the North Fork in general back then, even that not that long ago, was just less of a destination. I think it's a lot has changed in those 20 years. A lot of
Yes.
upscale things have happened in Greenport and on the North Fork. Uh, you know, I used to stay at the Silver Sands Motel, and
Hmm.
as we know, that got renovated, and now the prices are a little bit higher.
Yes.
It's part of the overall, I would say, South Forkification of the North Fork in a way,
Yes.
or just the general, the secret is out, and now everybody wants to go to the North Fork as well.
Hmm.
And don't forget, 40, 50 years ago, you didn't have the vineyards that you do now. So there's a lot that's been happening out on the East End, on the North Fork in the last few decades that's really helped make it a destination even more than it was already. So it's been interesting to see Greenport changing over the years.
Yes. Definitely. It's like you said, it's changed quite a bit, even since 2002. But also, you've also done a lot of interviews in your books. Can you share some memorable or impactful moments from your conversations, even with notable figures like Kurt Vonnegut or Rudy Giuliani, and even how
Yeah,
these interviews shaped your writing?
there have definitely been some interesting ones. Kurt Vonnegut was an interesting story. I was at grad school at UMass, and he was coming to campus to give a speech, and he held a student press conference, and so there was I don't know, maybe 12 or so of us in the room,
Hmm.
and I was I had my little tape recorder, but I kept it like under my on my lap. But there was an NPR reporter who just had her big tape recorder right on top of the table, and she was recording, and she had like a microphone, and Vonnegut got very flustered by that, and he said, "Where you shut that off? Get out of here!" Like he like practically threw her out of the room.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, I was recording, but I managed to ask him maybe four questions at that, and I, had them on tape, and I used them in a couple of the books I wrote. They were about censorship, and they were about topics that were important to him. Um, why do people protest? Why do people protest? Why do people ban books, and why do they protest? And his answer was because they're lonely and they're looking for something to do. They're looking for something to become a part of a cause, and they don't actually read the books. That's what he said. But it was very interesting, to be sitting there across from this towering hulk of him. I think he was 6'4", big guy,
Okay.
big presence. And I had read Slaughterhouse Five, of course, and just to be in his presence was kind of an awe-inspiring thing. So that was pretty cool. A
Yes.
lot of the interviews I've done by just by default have been over the phone because that's been the easiest way to contact people. So Giuliani, for example, was over the phone. It was interesting to interview him. This was for my book on the Supreme Court. I interviewed a lot of people for that book, and he seemed interested in the interview at first, and then when I think I sent him a copy of the book, and there was like no response. So I don't know if maybe he didn't like what I wrote or what I chose to print from the interview, but there have been plenty of good experiences. I have also, asked people to contribute forewords and introductions to my books, and there have been some good experiences with that. John McCain wrote a short foreword to my book, World War II for Kids.
Wow.
And shortly after the book came out, he was doing a book signing for his new book. And so I went to the book signing and I got to meet him and I gave him a copy of my book and I got his book. So it's kind of a cool thing to have happen. For another of my books, Senator Edward Kennedy wrote the foreword. It was about FDR. And of course, his family knew FDR's family. And he wrote the foreword and I sent him a copy of the book and he sent me a nice letter back thanking me. And, so there have been some nice experiences with those interviews. And interestingly, a lot of those interviews that I did about 20 years ago, it's actually harder now to interview people than it was then, because then you could more easily reach like a senator or a congressman or somebody. Now I feel like it's harder to get a person. You have these websites and you have contact information that's not even there a lot of the times. The easiest probably is a public official, but anybody else, it's really hard to get a hold of now.
Hmm.
Um,
It's kind
but
of
I'll talk more.
interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, it's kind of interesting because like we feel more connected and well, somewhat maybe we're more connected in the world today, but then it's harder to get a hold of people. There's all these kind of barriers kind of in the way, even though there might be a way of contacting someone, there's all these other hurdles.
Yeah, you now you can, follow them on this and that and the social media, but there's literally no way to contact them. Sometimes it's like you can contact their record label or their, the publicity person, but it's very hard now. The contact is this indirect contact by following them on social media. So
Hmm.
that changed somewhat too.
Yes. And also, you mentioned we talked about Joseph Roth in the beginning. I was curious when you were translating one of his books, were there any challenges translating that piece of work, or even just his particularly with those with historical or cultural significance, like him preserving the essence of his original text while ensuring it resonates with contemporary readers?
Yes, for two of the books, there was an existing English translation that was from the 30s, so I had something to work with to see how they handled it. The third book was a novel fragment called Prolefter about a man named Prolefter, and it was just basically like a sketch of his life. And that one was a real challenge because it was, never had been translated, and luckily I kind of felt the when I read it, I felt what Roth was trying to say and how he was trying to express himself. So I was able to, I think, get that across on the page, and I'm very pleased with how that came out. It's not something that was really, a bestseller or anything. It's not considered one of his best works. It's not even finished, but it is from his peak of his work, which is about 1935 or so for that one. But that was an interesting book because it really, while it's not a well plotted out novel, it's very Roth because it has so much character development and description at the expense of more plot. So it's really a very Roth book. It's got a lot of Roth's trademark kind of turns of phrase and descriptions and the way he writes his style. So it's actually a good one. While most people would say, well, read his more masterpiece books first, the Radetzky March, but other ones. This one's an interesting one, and I'm happy with how that turned out.
Wonderful. And now you've written well over 6,300 pages with all your books. What does your writing process look like when taking on such extensive an extensive project, or do you have any specific routines or methods that help you stay productive?
Yeah, the Four Kids books were the most challenging because they were like 40,000 words, and they needed to have 50 to 70 images, 21 activities. They were very intense, and I had to put a lot of time into researching them and interviewing people and talking to people. So that those were kind of like a very intensive process. With books on local history, I find they've been very rewarding because I get to take little field trips to the different areas and take pictures. And while I don't need to do like in the old days where you'd have to go to a local library or go to a historical, like everything's online pretty much, but
Hmm.
to go and see the places, to go take pictures, to go and understand what you're writing about, that's the fun part. So I'm not just cooped up with these books. I haven't just been cooped up. I've been able to go out and see places and get out of the house and then write about it afterwards. And that's been a saving grace for all of these local history books, all 30 plus of them, is that I've had, field trips to different places.
Yes. And now, even with all these books that you've completed throughout your career, what has been the biggest challenge you've faced as a writer, and how did you overcome it?
Interestingly, I think one of the biggest challenges has nothing to do with writing itself. Like the writing itself part, I am pretty good at getting myself to do it. It's the flip side that is a big challenge. It's the marketing and the promotion of the books after the fact. And I have been lucky in many ways with a lot of these books because people like yourself will contact me, and libraries will contact me, museums and different places, and to set up, lectures and stuff. So if I pushed really hard, I could, be doing 30 of these a year, interviews and lectures, but time is a challenge. So in that respect, it's not as much of a challenge because there is kind of like if you write a nonfiction book, word will get out and you'll get people to interested in it. But on the fiction side, it's been a challenge to really figure out what to do and promote. And self promotion is necessary, but it's important to have like a team, a person, somebody to help you. And I've recently got that, so that's been helpful to me to have somebody else be the kind of voice of promotion instead of me trying to sell myself, because it is hard to, you have
Yes.
to have some kind of, I won't say it's like selling snake oil, but it's just, it's like you know, I'm in the mindset of just making the product, and then I want to kind of leave some of that stuff to somebody else. And I think that's been a challenge, that
Hmm.
understanding that the nature of it requires that you have someone else to be able to do that instead of just trying to promote yourself constantly.
Yes. And then also with your books, how do you balance staying true to historical facts while making the content accessible and engaging for a wide range of audiences? Because I know you said for the children's books you're bringing it to their level and not talking down, but for adult books you said even they a lot of historic historical books can be very dry and dense, but I'm just curious how your process for kind of balancing the facts while making it engaging.
History can be weird. History can be interesting. Like the while the bare essentials of it can be dry, the quirks and the details can be and are often interesting.
Hmm.
Um, so sometimes you have to take a closer look at something to understand trends. And the key is to give specific examples and stories. Like, you can look at my neighborhood where I live and see a bunch of houses and think nothing of it. But then I can tell you a story that the house on the corner there down the street was actually moved there circa 1915, um, because it was in the center of town, and when it was built it was okay, but within a few years it got kind of noisy and busy, so the owner wanted to move it to where I am, which is only a few blocks away really, but to move it away from the downtown into more quiet place. So while the family was on vacation, the movers put the house on, I guess a flat bed of some kind, and horses pulled it, and they settled it into place, and everything was where it was supposed to be, all down to the knickknacks on the shelves. The family came home from the vacation, and they were in their new house a few blocks away. So that's the kind of little story that can enhance a history book. And I have so many examples of like that just from reading old newspaper articles and doing research and finding the little hidden things about what used to what used to be. And I think there's a lot of ways to make history interesting by telling those little stories instead of just see a lot of people when they write a history book, they kind of rely on previous history books. And so it's this continuous chain of history books. And what I try to do is go back to the source, but go back to the contemporaneous material that's available and find things that nobody else has found yet or nobody else has written about yet and
Yes,
tell those stories.
yes. No, that's really interesting. And now, given that your books are found in libraries across all 50 states and 15 countries, how do you feel about the impact your work has had on both the local community and a global audience? And I'm happy to say we have quite a few of your books at Floyd Memorial Library as well.
Well, that's good. It's always good to see my books somewhere and know that people are reading them, checking them out, trying to learn more about history.
Mhm.
I am proud of that. And my books have been translated into several languages, including Korean, Chinese, um, what else? Japanese, a few others as well.
Mm.
Um, Persian, I believe. That was an interesting one because it was, I think, two or three of my books were translated into Persian in Iran, and because Iran and the United States don't have a mutual copyright agreement, they were able to just do it without permission. without,
Hmm.
paying for the rights or doing anything. But the gentleman who was translating my book into Persian contacted me via email, and he, of course, spoke English. And he was asking me, I think, if I could write a little note to the kids that he would translate into their language. And so instead of being upset or, saying, well, you're stealing my work, I just was happy that children in Iran were going to read about archaeology and about Galileo. And so I was happy to do that. And I have copies of the books. He sent me copies of the finished books, translated books, which is kind of a cool thing.
Hmm.
So that, knowing that it's getting to places around the world is kind of a cool feeling, definitely.
Hmm. And I had another question that just came to mind because you mentioned that you've written a book about Greenport. I was curious during that process, was there anything that surprised you when you were writing that book, or that just was fascinating to you as well?
I think some of the stories about the whaling era and just really seeing how Greenport was very, very much a seaport town and how it was really, um, an important place in that time period
Hmm.
for the mariners. And, you have places like Preston's, on the water there that's like a testament to the founding, the nature of Greenport as it was in the 19th century. And of course, there's still a huge, you have so many boats there and you have so much marine activity there. But, trying to picture a whaling ship docked there. And one of the things I had read was an account from, I think it was the 1850s, and, how the sailors were in town before they left the port. And there are all these things going on and all these activities. And they went to the church and they had someone gave a speech. And so there was a lot of interesting stuff. And it was very interesting to picture a whaling ship and the whole fuss of these people leaving on a voyage when they might not come back for a year or two. And just that whole that Greenport was a part of that. That Greenport was one of the select ports in the Northeast that had that experience and that had, like Sag Harbor and like others, that had that experience. And it was kind of a interesting thing to picture.
Yes. And now, just as a writer, are there any upcoming projects you're excited about, or any topics you're hoping to explore in the future?
Yes, a few different things. I have a book coming out in the fall called 21st Century Long Island, which is a new kind of twist on history. It's the first 25 years of history of Long Island.
Hmm.
And with the idea that history happens so fast now with the internet, social media, the access to information, that we're living it, but we think about things and they seem so far away because so much happens. So many We take 1,000 pictures, a year. We read a million different stories and articles and things in our news feed. And so think about like the pre-COVID era seems like, decades ago, and it's,
Hmm.
now it's 5 years, but it seems it's like I think this book is needed because history has moved, life has moved, and change has happened so quickly that the first 25 years, it's like, what did I miss? Oh yeah, that happened. So I cover a lot of different little things like the opening of the aquarium in Riverhead, for example,
Hmm.
of course, COVID, and a lot of the different little things that have happened over the last 25 years. So that's one project that I'm excited about. Uh, I have, I've always got other things that I'm planning. I On the side, I've also been taking a lot of celebrity photos. That's one of my kind of side projects over the years, and I have, over 1,000 pictures of different people going back 20 plus years. So maybe one day I can put out a book of those pictures.
That's
Um,
just
one of my
that's kind of something that's a project you've been doing for a long time, just documenting or photographing like well-known people on Long Island or even in New York City.
mainly New York City, because I have access to, I'm near these television studios and I'm near these events, and so I've seen a lot of famous people over the years. And one of my best pictures was Taylor Swift back in 2012. She did a free concert in Times Square, and that was when she was big, but she wasn't huge yet.
Yes.
So I got a good picture of her looking up at the helicopter that was hovering above, and it's just kind of this pose that I captured, and I was always happy with that. But yeah, that's a side project too. And then I have been working lately on fiction. I have a novel that I just finished called Fletcher's Plan. It's a thriller, and I had recently put the first chapter out as a short story on Amazon, and I'm working on trying to get the full novel published. So I've been writing fiction for a long time, and I've only, I've been mainly doing the nonfiction as a, my paying gig, and I've been trying to work more on the fiction. But a couple of years ago, I did have my first novel, young adult novel called Escape 56, published by Triangle Square Books, and it's based on the true story of my mom's escape from communist Hungary in 1956.
Wow.
So proud of that book and wanting to use that as a springboard for more fiction in the future. So that's what I'm also hoping to do. Not going to completely abandon, of course, the local history stuff, but that's definitely a direction I'm trying to get into more as well.
Hmm. And also, just in terms of your own background as a writer, and you mentioned local history and nonfiction, you've been focusing on what advice would you want to give to someone that would be wanting to start out in a career within nonfiction and local history? Some advice you might offer them.
The advice is be curious, explore, go places, take a lot of pictures, ask a lot of questions, look for new angles, um, try to see things differently. The same things that you may be passing every day, look at them differently. This whole market has evolved. Like, 20 years ago, there were not as that many books out there. And 20 years ago, I could come up with a topic and it would pretty well not be something that existed yet. Now you have, in the tens of thousands of local history books. And if you go into your bookstore, you'll see just on Long Island books there, you'll see so many titles, Long Island Revolution, Long Island Marine books, Long Island Farming, Long Island Eating, Long Island Cemeteries, Long Island everything that you can think of.
Hmm.
So really for a writer starting out, you have to be curious enough to think of a new topic, a new angle, and there's still plenty. It's not a done deal. There's still a lot to cover, but you have to be open and curious and innovative in your thought process to write about something different. And there's plenty there. You just have to, it's not as obvious as it used to be because there's so many books on the bookshelf. So I think one piece of advice is go to the bookstore and look on the shelves in the local history section and see what's there already, and then see what isn't there.
Hmm. Yes. What other items or what you can offer to cover others parts of history that haven't been told or and even what fascinates you. But now looking back on your remarkable writing career, What are you most proud of?
I think, I thought about this a little bit. I think I'm thinking about this a little bit. And one thing I'm very proud of is a book that I wrote called Baseball History for Kids. And the book itself is the finished product, but I'm proud of the process of what I did to write that book. I interviewed 500 former baseball players. That's right, 500.
Wow.
Uh, I interviewed 70% of every living former baseball player who played before the year 1960. So
That's amazing.
I have all the tapes of all these people. Almost all of them I cold called. I found their numbers. I called them. I told them I'm writing a book for kids, and I asked them if I could ask them a few questions. Some of them only talked to me for 5 minutes. Some of them talked to me for an hour. Carl Erskine of the Brooklyn Dodgers was one that was very nice. I talked to Julia Ruth Stevens, who is Babe Ruth's daughter. So here, somebody saying, calling Babe Ruth daddy is kind of an interesting thing, mind blowing thing. I talked to
Mhm.
people who played with the greats like Mickey Mantle, Jackie Robinson, Ted Williams, Babe Ruth, people who were managed by some of the greats or whose coaches were some of these really historic players. And it was a labor of love. It was a passion. I did it pretty much every night. I tried to make some calls, and there are only a very few who I actually reached who wouldn't talk to me or who were rude. Most of them were friendly and contributed some very interesting stories about the golden era of baseball from the 40s to the late 50s. And one thing interesting about this, back when I was doing the book, I was started to do the interviews in 2012 and wrap them up in like 2015. But back then, I interviewed probably, 100 plus people who played in the 40s. As of this moment, there is only one player left who played in the 1940s. That's Bobby Shantz, the pitcher. He's the
Hmm.
only one left. So I've preserved something. I've preserved stories and I've preserved history of baseball, which I love. And to me, that's something I'm very proud of. So
Yes.
that's something that stuck out in my head because it's been, every time I see another one passes away, I say, "Oh, I interviewed them. I interviewed him," and it's something that maybe one day I'll do something with because I did use those interviews obviously for the book, but the book was short and the interviews have much more in them. So maybe one day that's something that I can have a whole book of baseball quotes or something.
Yeah, definitely. No, that sounds really important. And like you said, as more people pass, you were able to capture and preserve some of that history. So that sounds really interesting.
And some of
Um,
these people also keep in mind, these are people now, if you tried to contact baseball players today, you couldn't. There was no way to reach them. But a lot of these people, we're talking about people who were 40, 50, 60 years removed from their careers, and nobody cared about their baseball days. I mean, some of them, yes, like Carl Erskine and some of these others, yes. But these guys who played a year or two, um, they were thrilled that somebody was interested. And some of them were, telling me that their health issues or that they were depressed or that they, it was good to talk about remember the old days. And so I felt good in that I was engaging them in something that was their passion and was forgotten by many, but I was remembering it. So
Absolutely. Um, and then just at the end, I usually just ask if there was anything else you'd like to say or discuss that we haven't talked about.
I would say, you're a writer if you have to write. you don't write because you don't write to be published. You write because you have to write, and hopefully you'll get published. I've always written since I can remember, and it's not a hobby because a hobby is something you don't need. This is like air and food and water and shelter. This is writing is in there. It has to happen. So it's always been that way. And I think for people who understand what I said, they get it. They know that if you're a writer, you'll write no matter what. And that's always been what I've done. I've always written. So it's just a part of me. And I'm happy that I have been able to share with people and get people to read and understand history and learn about things. And that makes me feel good that I could spread some of this information that was lost for a long time. So,
Yes. No, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story and really all the wonderful work you're doing with writing about the history of New York City and Long Island. Thank you so much.
well, thank you for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 129 with Richard Panchyk. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.